All right. Next up, I'm going to be presenting a paper by Andrea Duran et al. This is a group out of the Columbia University Medical Center in New York, and this was published published ahead of print in December 2022. And they were trying to answer the question, what is the optimal frequency and duration for sedentary breaks to improve blood glucose, that was a primary outcome, and blood pressure, that was a secondary outcome, during an 8-hour sedentary period. And, you hear this sitting is the new smoking has been said over the past few years. And I actually looked it up, and there's a paper from 2018, which we could link to for the show notes, but it's hilarious. They're like, actually, that's not correct. So while sitting is not great, like the hazard ratio for mortality or whatever statistic they're looking at is like way less. Smoking is definitely worse than sitting. But still, I do still think this is an important study. And there are some associations with sitting and mortality and increased blood pressure and being sedentary. So it is worth looking at. So this is where they randomized. It was only 11 healthy adults. They were actually trying to randomize more than that, but COVID happened, so they kind of stopped enrollment. These were adults over 45 years old, and they had to be sedentary for about 8 hours a day on average, and they couldn't have any underlying conditions, and they shouldn't be exercising too much, no more than 3 days a week. And they brought them into a lab, and they gave them a standardized breakfast and lunch, and then they experimented with walking breaks on a treadmill every half hour or every hour, and they varied the length of the breaks. They're trying to find like the minimal effective dose of light physical activity to improve blood sugar and blood pressure. So I thought it was a pretty cool study, and this got a lot of play in the news. The top line results was like, taking short breaks from sitting can drastically lower your blood sugar and can lower your blood pressure. So that was the top line results. So questions, comments, concerns, maybe Rahul, we can start with you here.
Yeah. Matt, I think the thoughts that you shared before we recorded about this paper are really sophisticated. So I want to get out of your way and let you do that. I will just say, though, this paper is full of gems of lines. There's a line where they describe walking, and they say walking was selected as the activity modality because compared with other aerobic activities, it is popular, familiar, convenient, and free. I hope somebody describes interacting with me like that someday, because that's just a home run.
What about you, Paul? Anything? Any questions or comments?
I more question. I mean, we talked a little about this, but I would just like to hear you say, like, who are these 11 people? I'm just trying to think, and because it seems like they were pretty healthy, sort of based on what I'm reading, but they also didn't exercise. And then also were often sedentary. It's like this weird sort of unicorn person who's maybe not, and I apologize if you're one of the 11 people part of the study, to make it to 45 without being intentional about being healthy and then not having any major health problems, which actually were excluded in my understanding from the study. So so I guess I would like to hear about this population.
Well, a fair amount of them had pre-diabetes. I think like 2 of them are on blood pressure medication. So it wasn't like they were totally devoid, but they didn't have any major end organ disease. High blood pressure, I consider, I thought that would have been an exclusion criteria, but when I was reading through, some of the patients did have high blood pressure. And so this, what's interesting about this is they looked at both periods of 1 minute of walking. It was just on a treadmill at like 2 miles per hour, or 5 minutes of walking. And then they did 1 minute every 30, or 5 minutes every 30, or 1 minute every 60, or 5 minutes every 60 minutes of sitting. And they found that for lowering blood sugar, it looks like 5 minutes out of if you walk 5 minutes for every 30 minutes you're sitting, that seems to really lower blood sugar. And my reading of this was, it was like the difference between a totally sedentary person and somebody walking 5 minutes out of every 30, there was like almost a 33-point difference in blood sugar, at the peak after a meal. So they were giving them these standardized meals and then they had continuous glucose monitors. They were checking every 15 minutes. So it did really blunt the peak. And they also had a lower nadir of the blood sugar as well compared to the people who were sedentary. So it did seem like it was regulating it. And then And that was just seen really, the blood sugar effects were really just seen with the 5-minute walking group out of every 30 minutes, but not the 5 minutes walking every 60 minutes. So it's pretty frequent breaks. I'm not sure how realistic that is for the average like office worker, but the blood pressure, even just walking 1 minute out of every 30 or 1 minute out of every 60, on average, there was like 3 to 5 point drop in blood pressure just for taking those brief breaks. And I think, all this stuff about the blood sugar and blood pressure has been shown in other studies. They were just trying to find like a minimum effective dose for this and something that was practical. So I do think more research should be done on this. I just think this was such a small and controlled study and a specific group of patients that I just wonder, would the effects be a lot bigger if you had a sicker group, like people who had dysregulated blood sugar? Would it plummet even more? And would the blood pressure drop even more? So I definitely think this is worth looking into because it's like Rahul said, it's free and it's a familiar activity.
And gosh darn it, it's fun.